Hey all you vets out there, welcome to my channel. This is your Veteran Tech Guide. The purpose of this channel is to provide veterans or soon to be veterans with skills that are being used in today's technology industry. My name is Isaac. I spent about 7 years in the US Army. Now I'm a systems analyst working in corporate America. With this channel I want to do something a bit different. I want you as the veteran to consider your skills, knowledge, and experiences, and I want to be able to show you how we can take a military scenario and through technology connect it over to the business world. So follow me and I'll lead the way for you to explore, learn, and thrive in the technology industry. Let's go ahead and get started. Today we're starting out with the basics. We're going to go over some important key terms that you should know when working with relational databases. So what we'll do is we'll describe the definition, we'll talk through the military example, and then we'll also talk through the business example. And at the very end, we're going to build a query to show you how all of these definitions come together. Now, at this point, if you don't know what a query is, that's fine because that's going to be our last definition, so stay tuned. But for now, you probably guessed our very first definition is going to be a database, right? And a database is a structured collection of information stored electronically. A lot of these definitions, you can just pull them up on Google, but we're really actually talking about what they really mean. So, what is this definition telling us? Well, we can think of a database as a digital warehouse where data is sent to and easily accessed. Essentially, this is the place that it's being stored. What we can also think of a database as is just a centralized location where data is sent to and stored and then eventually going to be used by the business to visualize or see some insights that are happening within that business. And if you're a CEO, that's super important, right? And they don't see all of these little pieces that are happening. But for us, the IT guys, it's important to have an organized database so that we can easily pull that information out. So really for the database for now, just think of the structure of the storage, right? Maybe when you're doing BI layouts, the container is everything that's holding that data or that item as we're talking through this example here. And then eventually we want to go into that container and pull something out and be able to use it. Same concept here. But for our military example, just to build upon that, we can think of things like our personnel record, right? All of the information about us is being sent to a database and somebody somewhere is using that information to better analyze maybe, duty stations, just personnel in general, who is where as an example. But another example we can use is something like our clothing record, right? Everyone that enters our service has a clothing record from the day you enter to the day you get out. And those updates, those changes are continuously following you throughout your years of service. But it's important to know that everything on that clothing record is essentially sent to a database so that it can be sent to, stored, collected, and then provide insights later on. Our insight here is as an example, maybe you want to turn in your fleece jacket whenever you're getting out, and for some reason you have 3, but on your clothing record it says that you're only turning in 2. Updates and changes like that are cases that we can find a database useful. But for our business example, very similar concept here. We're looking at our personnel records. We're looking at the people who are employed by the organization, people where are they working, which department, who is their manager, who is their supervisor, and keeping track of things like that. Again, it's the structure, and very similar for the inventory records, right? So in business, we have all these different devices like our laptop, our computer, our monitors, maybe cell phones, right? We want to know who those are assigned to. So the database essentially is tracking things as such. But moving on to our next definition is going to be a database management system. The database management system is also known as the DBMS, and a DBMS allows users to create, modify, retrieve, maintain information in a database. So really those users who are using the DBMS are a little bit more technical, right? And what they're doing is they're writing specific code or scripts in order to dig into that database to provide the insights that are happening to their business users. Now for this slide here, I don't have a military and business example because what you're seeing on the screen, the MySQL, the Microsoft SQL Server, and the Oracle database are essentially popular softwares that are being used in today's industry. But it's important to know here, for a few of these, you're seeing the letters SQL. right? That's going to pop up a lot when you're working with relational databases because that's the scripting language that's being used. And it's also referred to as SQL or SQL. But for now, you can remember that as the structured query language. So if someone's referring to SQL or SQL, they're referring to the structured query language. So that's just to provide a little bit of information there. But I don't want to forget here, there's a lot of questions in the industry. What is the difference between a database and a database management system? Well, as I mentioned before, the database is essentially the structure that everything is being stored in. The database management system is essentially the user interface that us technical people are working with. It's essentially the software that we're using to communicate to the database in order to pull that information. So I just wanted to clarify that here. But our next definition is going to be a table. And for the table, it's super important. It's just a structural piece here, but a table is the fundamental structure within a database organizing data into rows and columns. Now, the database, as I mentioned, is that structure, but there are a few more structural pieces that go along with making up that database. And the table is going to be the first one that we're encountering here. So as an example here, what I want you to do when you're thinking of a table, think of a specific topic, right? For our military example, we can think of our soldiers, we can think of our vehicles, our buildings. Essentially, with our table, the data in that table is essentially representing what we're talking about in that database. For now, it can be soldiers, vehicles, and buildings. But for our business example here, again, think about just a specific topic, products, orders, salespeople. We're collecting data about that specific topic to live in that table and then essentially be represented by the database. So there are a few key terms here that are going to build off of this table, and we'll go through that as well. The first one is going to be a record, and a record is a single entry in a table representing a unique instance of data. And this is how we store specific pieces of information in a table. Now, when we think of a record, I want you to think of it as kind of individualized, right? If you're familiar with Excel, what we're doing is taking that same logic here, right? That we can create a table in Excel, and then for each row, we can represent that as its own individual record. We're going to talk about a primary key here in a few slides, which is our unique identifier. But for now, think of a record as being individualized. For our military example, to help us grasp this a bit, think of each item in your clothing record, right? That one item is its own record, right? And that would be represented by a row in your clothing record. For our business example here, maybe you are working with a lot of customers, and each customer in the customer table has its own record. So kind of simplistic there, but we'll have a visual representation here in a moment. Now, our next definition is going to be a field, and a field is a specific piece of data within a record, breaking down records into manageable parts. Each field contains one type of information. Now, I won't break down the type for the moment because there can be multiple types like integer, varchar, and char. We'll talk about that in a future video, so stay tuned. But for our military example here, we're trying to basically, for this field, we're calling this also an attribute. And the attribute is telling us information about what's happening in that record. For an example, we could look at name, rank, and unit, right? For that one record, maybe it's representing John Smith, right? And John Smith's name is, of course, John Smith. John Smith's rank is maybe sergeant, and his unit is maybe, 10th Mountain Division. But for our business example here, again, sticking with this field, things like product name, price, quantity, information about that specific record. It's essentially just giving it a little bit more structure with the manageable parts like columns. For our next definition, it's going to be a primary key. And the primary key is essentially a unique identifier for each row in a table. Now, each row in a record has to have its own primary key, its own unique identifier, right? This is how we tell row 1 from row 2 to row 3. more than likely that's going to be represented by a specific number. But for our military example, sticking with that number theme, we could think of something that identifies us, like our social security number, our CAC ID number. For instance, if you have multiple John Smiths in one unit, how do you tell John Smith versus John Smith, right? That person is going to, of course, have their social security number, and that's going to follow them. That's going to uniquely identify that individual, no matter where they go, whether they're doing great things, they're doing bad things, they're moving duty stations, they're being promoted. We're always going to know that John Smith is aligned with social security number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, right? And so for our business example here, sticking with this primary key, the employee ID, right? The employee ID is essentially tied to our badge ID, right? And that allows us access into a building. And anytime that we get into a building, that ID is being marked in the system, more than likely being sent to a database to say, hey, John Smith just entered the building. Another example is our customer ID. We need to be able to identify who our customers are, and maybe we've worked with similar customers in the past, and we want to tie the same ID back to that same customer. But for now, our last definition here is going to be query, and a query is a request for information from a database. It's essentially our search. If you were to go to Google, you're going in there and you're typing something in. Show me all of the Veteran Tech Guide's information or his videos and his content, and that's essentially what we're doing here with a query. Very similar. It allows us to extract specific data quickly and efficiently. So essentially, like I mentioned, it's just a search in the database that we're trying to pull information for. And so for our military example here, when we are getting ready to ETS, there's a lot of information in the database, in the table, in the record, in the field that gives us information about what's happening in that specific database. For an example, maybe in the database we want to find the service members who are ETSing in June, right? We just write up a query, and that information is going to be sent to us via the database. For our business example here, maybe we want to go into the database and we want to tell the database, show me the products that have or that cost the most, or just I want to know the cost of these products. I write a really quick query, send that to the database, and it comes back to me and provides insight into what the database is actually saying. So now let's jump into the query and put all of these definitions together. So let's start out with a blank sheet here. Currently, I am in Azure Data Studio, and I have a sheet open here, but Azure Data Studio would be an example of the DBMS that I mentioned previously in the definitions, right? This is giving us access. This is the software that is giving us access to be able to modify, enhance the data that is in the database, right? And so right now I currently have Docker Desktop running in the background, and then Azure Data Studio is essentially running on top of that. And right now I'm currently using a Mac system. I prefer Mac in these examples to just kind of learn a little bit more about these integrations. I also have a Windows, really for just if you're trying to understand, learn examples, either one is fine, right? But for now, let's start out with the blank sheet. And what I wanted to do is, with the definitions that we talked about previously, I really wanted to put that together in a query, start out with some basic query here. And as I mentioned, SQL or SQL is a structured query language. And when we're working with relational databases, that's going to be something that we should be familiar with. So let's start out with some basic commands. Now, I want to start out with create table command. And this command tells us the database system that we want to use. We want to create a new table. And I want to focus on personnel. And this is something that I'm going to continue to build on as these videos progress. I'll be building off of this personnel table, or maybe it'll be a soldiers table, or maybe it'll be a products table. But for now, let's create the table personnel. And as I mentioned previously, personnel is the table, and think of this like a topic. We want to select names so that they can be easily identifiable to the people that are working in the database. If you create a table that is maybe AAA, no one's going to understand what that table is about. But personnel gives it a lot of good structure here. right? It's a clear name. It helps maintain organization here, so we want to keep that name for now. And what I mentioned previously, kind of keeping in line with the records, the field, and the primary key, all of this stuff is being built into the query, right? And so what I want to do is I want to start out with the primary key. And I mentioned earlier there are different types that you can build from your field, but for now we're just going to call this an integer because this is going to be an ID that we want to have as a record in our row, or excuse me, as a field in our record. ID int, and we're going to call this our primary key, or this is going to be our primary key, excuse me. And then we're going to separate it by a comma, and then we're going to move on to the next field, and we're going to say we want this field to be labeled as name. We're going to give it a type of varchar, and essentially what we're doing here is we're going to give it a limit constraint, right? We can change the 50 to 10. Maybe we don't want the user to enter more than 50, or we want to keep them to 3. That's very applicable when you're talking about abbreviations for states. But for now, let's just give this name a character limit of 50. Move on to the next field, and the next field is going to be rank, another varchar, and varchar is going to represent different characters. And we're going to say 20. For now, if we wanted to have an abbreviation, maybe instead of the full name of sergeant, we just wanted to use SJT. Maybe staff sergeant, we didn't want to write all that. We can use an abbreviation of SSGT. But for now, let's just give the rank 20. Made a little bit of an error there. What's nice about these systems is that it's going to look at your syntax, and the syntax is essentially the language or the code that you're using, and all of these different programming languages have a certain way that they should be written. So this one identifies if an error is going to occur with those squiggly lines underneath. Now for our next one, let's type duty station. Duty station, let's keep it one word. Again, a varchar type. Varchar, maybe this one should be a little bit more. Some of those duty stations are a little bit lengthy. Fort Lee is a short one, but maybe you are going to Fort Richardson in Alaska, right? Let's keep that there. And so let's describe this a little bit more. All right, let me highlight a few points. Again, just to back brief, we're creating a table here using the personnel name as the name of this table. We're creating the ID here, which is essentially our primary key. We're creating a field that is known as name, rank, and duty station. Now, let's go ahead and close it off. Now, for certain types of the SQL language here, you're going to need a semicolon to close it off. For others, you may not. Let's go ahead and run this. And we can see, based off the message that the DBMS is sending to us, this command completed successfully. Now, here is another SQL command that basically allows us to look into the database or look into the table and see what's actually in it, right? Maybe you are coming upon, you're just coming into an organization. They tell you to run a few SQL commands because that's part of your primary duties, but you don't understand the data that at this time. What you can do is you can use this very simple command, select star. Select is a basic command that's going to essentially say search for this. The star is going to say it's going to represent all. You're saying select all in, let's say, personnel. Demos. Right. Here's an important thing. Let's break this down a little bit more. So select, again, you're searching. Star is representing all. You're saying, give me all of the information in the table. And basically you're saying, select all from the personnel table, right? Let's run this. And right now there's no information in that table. It's essentially just the structure. Later on, we'll be talking about inserting some data into the table here. But for now, this is just to show you that our command above worked as expected, and we're seeing the fields as they would in a very similar Excel document, right? We have the ID, we have the name, we have the rank, we have the data duty station, and then eventually once we insert the data, records will fall underneath this. So that's it for today's video. We went over a few key terms that you should know when working with relational databases. If you found this information helpful, please consider following my other socials and liking, subscribing on this video here, as well as sharing this information with other veterans. So until next time, this is your Veteran Tech Guide, where we are exploring, learning, and thriving in tech. See ya.